Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome again. My name is Kath Hardy. I'm with the Biological Resource Division within the National Park Service, and I serve as the team lead for Scaling Up. And our Tools and Policy team puts on a monthly webinar series where we feature a different topic each month, ideally a tool that enables parks or programs to work beyond park boundaries. Today we are featuring a really unique initiative and highly successful, the Yellowstone to Yukon. And we are excited to have Dr. Jodi Hilty be our presenter. Again, each month we host a different webinar, so if you would like to learn more about that, I've plugged in 2 different website links where you can learn about our past webinars as well as the upcoming webinars that we have on our schedule. So with that said, we'll keep it to about 30-45 minutes today. We'll have a presentation from Jodi, and then the last 10 minutes or so we'll leave for questions and answers. Okay. So Jodi, why don't you go ahead and take it away, and if folks have questions as the presentation's going, feel free to use that chat or question box, and we'll get to those at the end.
Great. Cass, I want to just confirm that you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to assume everyone else can too. Thank you for hosting this, and thank you all for being on this call today. It's a pleasure and an honor to get to talk to you about one of the most intact mountain ecosystems in North America. It's a place where we can have animals like this wolverine shown here that are really quintessential wilderness animals. I had the really good fortune of actually running into one when I was with 2 other colleagues, and we were stunned into silence, and this wolverine just really didn't care that we were there, just sort of looked at us like, what are you doing there? And just wandered on his way right past us without any sense of fear. It's a pretty amazing place. For some reason. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about just what Y2Y is and how it came to be as a conservation vision. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we, meaning we, the big we, the 300 plus partners, use science to guide forward this large landscape vision. And particularly, there's a public lands component. Particularly in Canada, there's some opportunity for new protected areas, but also management as we learn from science about how to do things better. There's a private lands piece because there's so much rock and ice that's protected in this region, but less so the private valley land bottoms that often serve for connectivity. And then, of course, when there are other issues really around human-wildlife conflict, whether it's wildlife becoming pancakes on roads or other types of conflict that are coming into play in this landscape and need to be resolved if this is going to stay one of the world's most intact ecosystems. So there's no better way to really understand what wildlife need than through the eyes of wildlife themselves. This wolf that's asleep right here was one of the early wolves to get GPS collars. It was a time in the 80s and 90s where we really had an opportunity to use new technology to help us understand where secretive wildlife were going. And in case of this female wolf, Pluie, she happened to make 100,000 square kilometer jaunt across 2 countries, across several states, across 2 provinces, and ultimately over 30 different jurisdictions, from tribal lands to public lands to private lands and beyond. She was ultimately legally shot with her pups just south of Kootenay National Park. And it was these kinds of movements that caused conservationists in Canada and the US to go, oh, wow, we should probably be working together because it seems like wildlife aren't recognizing this border. Another sort of source of information was really looking backwards at what used to be. This is the distribution of large mammals, of hoofed animals and carnivores historically and today. And what you can see is that there's really a massive shrinking of these animals, and one of the last strongholds, one of the last places where these animals exist is in Y2Y. I think the third piece of information was really looking at what's happening to grizzly bears. So that pink, light pink in the bottom is what used to be their distribution. By 1922, there were these small islands of populations all across the southern U.S., and ultimately all but one blinked out. The one red spot that's not connected to the larger red area is that of Yellowstone National Park. And it's not surprising, right? Science says that small isolated populations are likely at some point to be all male or all female, and they're likely to go extinct, or in the case of bears, they might also not be tolerated. And so what you can see is that this was sort of, you know, the last place, because it's so remote and such amazing wilderness, to really try to maintain them through time. And certainly the 90s was a time that you know, was a time of recovery for animals like grizzly bears, like wolves and others. So ultimately, the founders came together and they said, okay, so what do we need? We need a place that can inspire everyone. And so they defined the greater the Yellowstone to Yukon ecosystem as this 2,000-mile stretch from literally Wyoming, from the bottom of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, all the way up to the Arctic Circle in the Yukon. And from the very beginning, the vision was to connect and protect this habitat so that both people and nature could thrive, leaving a legacy. And they wanted it to be, and it is, a movement that is science-driven, meaning trying to use the latest science to drive forward the best conservation that we can. And I mentioned this before, but it's super collaborative. So there's Y2Y, the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, which I run, which is 22 people, but there's the 300 plus collaborators, which are often agencies, First Nations, Native Americans, NGOs, corporate players, hunters and fishermen, a whole gathering of people who see eye to eye on making this happen. And there's actually lots of people who aren't connected to necessarily Y2Y itself, but are still moving forward conservation in the region. And really, why would we have this kind of vision? It's really about keeping animals like caribou and wolverines, bull trout, grizzly bears, and many, many other animals that really aren't faring well across a lot of their range, keeping them intact and allowing them space to move throughout the system. So one of the things that I found really interesting is that the early founders had a suspicion that if you were to protect grizzly bears, and you were to do it well and reconnect them and protect them, that actually you would be also servicing the needs of most other wildlife. And we worked with the University of Montana over the last 5 or 6 years with Mark Hebelwhite and Robin Stinwig, and lo and behold, her dissertation research actually shows that they are great umbrella species, which is reassuring that the instincts of the founders got that right. Now, obviously, we work on a lot more than just grizzly bears, but they are one of those species that we do pay special attention to because of this. So one of the reasons why I was really excited to take the position of leading the organization, Y2Y CI, is because of these maps. And I think this is a really important thing as groups like the National Park Service and others really start thinking about the importance of what Pluie told us. What did she tell us? She told us that that's that wolf that we saw earlier that went across the border, that literally protected areas are super important, but they're not going to be adequate for these large ranging species. So how do we get it right? And it turns out that if you do work across partners and at such a large landscape scale, you can make a difference. One way to measure that is by protected areas and other conservation achievements. So really significant advances from 1993 when the vision was formed to 20 years later in 1994 when we almost doubled the protected areas. Likewise, you can look at other conservation, and that's things like might be caribou wintering ranges in the state in Canada. It might be changes in riparian management or travel management plans in the U.S., but there have been increases in other kinds of maybe non-permanent but really important designations of protection. It also could be conservation easements. That's one way to look at it. There's also non-land extensive things there. I'll talk about it later, but things like crossing structures, coexistence, and other things. Likewise, one of the other things that Y2Y and its founders were really committed to and continue to be committed to is pushing a paradigm shift from protected areas as the answer to biodiversity conservation to considering protected areas within the context of a larger landscape and thinking about how we connect it and protect them together in a holistic way so that large ranging animals can survive. What's really cool is that we know we've had an impact. When I was at the World Conservation Congress, I sat on a shuttle on the way to the Congress, and this woman said, "Oh my gosh, you're from Y2Y. I'm part of B2B or Baja to Bering. We're trying to do the marine equivalent of Y2Y." We also worked directly with folks in Australia on Alps to Atherton, providing advice, which eventually became the Great Eastern Ranges Corridor, and many other efforts that we know Y2Y has had a direct influence in either helping to get off the ground or inspiring. And that's really important because I think we are seeing a global shift, and I think it's what we have to do if we want to conserve conservation. That's what science says. We have a particularly provocative scientist in E.O. Wilson who says we need half Earth. And I put this in here because we've certainly made a lot of progress in the Y2Y region. We're not at half of the Y2Y, and we're not really sure. The science doesn't exist to tell us exactly what we need. And I think the answer is it depends on sort of the configuration and activities of humans and so forth. But we know we have a lot further to go, and I think Dr. Wilson really points that out in his most recent book. So now I'm going to sort of look forward at what we are currently working on. So one piece of that is public lands. In the Northwest Territories, you'll see a big dark green area, which is Nahanni National Park. There's a picture on the right. That park was purposely expanded to include the definition of ecological integrity, which is required by Parks Canada. And there was a lot of science that Dr. John Weaver from the Wildlife Conservation Society did, and others in collaboration with the Decho First Nations, who really want to see significant parts of their territory much better protected. And that park was expanded by sixfold. So if you look at it, obviously it's one of the larger national parks now today. There's more opportunity for protected areas, particularly in Canada. So I'll just talk about two briefly, because those protected areas are important cores and sometimes connectivity zones in this larger landscape. So the first area I'm going to talk about is a place called Peace River. It's in northeastern British Columbia, and it's the narrowest section of the Y2Y region. You can see it doesn't have a lot of protected areas. It's at 2.5% protected areas. And there are animals like caribou who are, their populations are decreasing somewhere between 10 and 50% a year. So one might ask why. This is why. So this is a close-up of that region. Every single one of those red lines represents either a road, a pipeline, a transmission line, a linear feature of disturbance. Caribou do not do well there. This is the most industrialized piece of land in all of Canada. It is where the natural gas is being drilled largely to fuel getting oil out of the oil sands. But where is the opportunity? So we've been working in that community and with Treaty 8 First Nations for quite a while now. And we share a vision of needing to rebalance this landscape. It's a really critical one. It's also, if it does get severed, it would be the end of the Y2Y vision. And so we're working on a place that we're calling the Wild Hearts. And really it's a story where we want to see anchor protected areas expanded and increased in this one area that remains relatively untouched, so that as restoration moves forward in the rest of the landscape, which it is supposed to, with all of this different kinds of development, there's an anchor place that animals like caribou, but also many, many other species in this area can continue to thrive and also recover. So that's a really exciting opportunity with lots of different players who are working together. And I wanted to point out, this is a really neat video of a few caribou and their young walking across, and this is really the last place, the wild hearts, where we could see that happening in this region without significant restoration, which in many cases takes hundreds of years. So we're going to move a little bit further south, and this is an interesting story about the missing piece between Banff and Jasper, and it's one that I ponder a lot, and it's because you might not know this, but Banff National Park used to be a lot bigger than it is today, and it's a reminder to me that for all the conservation gains that we achieve, whether it's protected areas or changes in culture, we really have to be watchful and mindful that society continues to value them, so that we don't have a backslide like we did with Banff National Park, where a lot of what we're talking about in this area that's called the bighorn, or the missing tooth between Banff and Jasper, become unprotected, and then we have to try to restore the connections there. This is a really important place for things like grizzly bears, different trout species that are endangered, and so forth. And this is where I have to talk about U.S. versus Canada. We all often tend to think that the Canada is one of those countries that doesn't have very many people and has low impacts, but that gray area in that map and the black area, that is all energy development. It is super heavily developed from an energy perspective, and it has a massive footprint. And actually, if you look at the U.S., it looks relatively benign in comparison. This is another, the purple area is the bighorn area, and what I'm going to do is start layering impacts. So there's cut blocks to the east of that area. There are utility corridors across so much of it. There are well sites, and there are roads across this region, and of course there's the seismic lines from energy development. And so you look at that purple area, which is the bighorn, and it really is one of the last opportunities. We're in a really fortunate position where the federal government in Canada, and also the Alberta government, they're co-chairing a committee called Canada Target 1. It is the country's goal to get to 17% protected areas, which is the global goal for terrestrial protected areas. And this is one of those places where they could conserve it. What's interesting to me, though, is that actually the thing that speaks most loudly to the local community is actually about headwaters conservation. Why? Because they look at examples like New York City saved the Catskills and did actually land acquisition and easements in order not to have higher standard water treatment plants. Vancouver did very much the same. Edmonton, which is one of the biggest towns where the water is serving from the bighorn, 88% of the water from the bighorn serves the Edmonton community, also doesn't have to look far to look at what happens when you don't do a good job conserving headwaters. So in 2013, Alberta and specifically Calgary suffered some big floods, and there was actually water and rivers running right downstream or right down the main streets of Calgary. And so I think Edmonton doesn't want to see that happen, and this headwaters conservation really rings loudly for them as a reason for conserving it. Frankly, from a science perspective, it also is critically important for both biodiversity and people to do a good job conserving headwaters. So I'm going to move us a little further south, really to the border region of Canada, Montana, Idaho, and into the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. There's a neat story here. I inferred earlier that grizzly bears have been recovering. A lot of you probably follow this, but grizzly bears are about arguably within 70 miles of each other, right where it says between the and high, that gap there, that's approximately one of the places where they had a verified grizzly bear. And what's cool about where it was is that they actually didn't know, and they unfortunately couldn't tell from the genetics samples that they did pick up, whether it was a crown of the continent ecosystem bear or whether it was a greater Yellowstone ecosystem bear. It's a story of hope, but it's also a story of importance, because over over time, if Greater Yellowstone ecosystem remains an isolated bear population, most likely there will be genetic problems. And so even in the recovery report, there's discussion about the importance of connectivity. What's the best kind of connectivity? It's really about landscape level connectivity, and we might get there. I'm going to talk about a specific project that helps us envision how that could happen. And it's right in the Cabinet Purcells in northwestern Montana, right where that circle is, Idaho, British Columbia. So Michael Proctor is in the front here. He's a grizzly bear biologist. He worked closely with Chris Dervine, and they got a look at the landscape, really, again, through the eyes of grizzly bears. Where were these grizzly bears going? There were only 10 grizzly bears in 1990. Fortunately, through some restoration efforts, bringing grizzly bears in, as well as the work of more than 60 organizations, there are now over 50 grizzly bears in this ecosystem. Last year, there were 0 reported incidences, conflicts between grizzly bears and humans, and that's largely because of work around education, putting in electric fences around potential attractants and so forth. But I'm going to talk about the private lands piece. So what did Michael's work show us? Well, one of the things that Michael's work showed us and the research showed was that there are 3 critical corridors that are important for keeping this population of grizzly bears connected to other populations. So on this map, you'll see Duck Lake, Kidd Creek, and Wild River Estates. Working collaboratively with local land trusts who might never otherwise prioritize beat up pieces of land that are the last places where grizzly bears can cross through. We now have the Duck Lake corridor 98% secure with purchases and easements, and Kidd Creek 50% secure. We just worked with Vital Grounds, which is a land trust, and we brought in half the money, they brought in half the money to purchase 7 of 12 subdivisions of Wild River, and we're looking to, we have the purchase rights that we have to close by 2018 to get the last one. This is a subdivision where literally the roads were already laid. They were ready to literally bring the houses in. And it was one of the most important corridors for grizzly bears and for other wildlife. And so it's pretty exciting to be able to see that sort of tangible progress with working across so many different institutions. I'm going to go backwards 1 second. I want to point out in this map that says the Bitterroot Recovery Zone and it's blank. That's because right now in the largest wilderness in the lower 48 states, there aren't any grizzly bears. There was a proposal, and in fact, it was moving forward until the Bush administration stopped it, to do a reintroduction of grizzly bears into that area. One of the reasons that we chose to work up in northwestern Montana, Idaho, British Columbia area was that biologists like Chris Dervine and Michael Proctor said, if you want to restore grizzly bears down to the salmon sellway naturally, which is really the only feasible way right now, that population could be really critical for that recovery. And so, you know, we'll see, but that is an area where it would make sense for grizzly bears to be from a land perspective, but we'll see what happens over the long term. So moving a little bit further south, there was a great paper published about 2 or 3 weeks ago from the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team. And what they did was they looked at where bears are most likely to move between Yellowstone National Park and Glacier National Park. So those purple areas are the highest likelihood of areas where grizzly bears will move based on the collection of data from both the Crown of the Continent and Yellowstone bears. This is super exciting because this is the map, much like the map that Michael Proctor created a little bit further north on the border region of where are the critical corridors. And I think it's safe to say that this is one of the largest large carnivore data sets out there. It corroborates with research that wolverine biologists, black bear biologists, and others have done. And it really tells us in this enormous landscape, much of which is private land, valley bottoms, with some high elevation protected areas, where we could focus our work, at least from the perspective of a grizzly bear. There's a lot of social science and community outreach issues that need to take place for that to be secured in the long term. My vision, my hope for this region is that because it's one of the last places in the lower 48 where grizzly bears are, that people might eventually, in a few generations, live with pride in what, you know, in this incredibly awesome landscape with large carnivores like grizzly bears. Another component is roads. Roads are a big source of what I would call wildlife-human conflict in the form of wildlife getting hit, people getting hurt. This picture is taken in Banff. It's one of the first wildlife overpasses in the Y-to-Y region. There are 40-some wildlife underpasses and overpasses in Banff. It's the most well-studied wildlife crossing system. It's also one of the first things that Y-to-Y strongly advocated for, based on the science that showed that there was increasing genetic isolation on the through Banff National Park, the north part of the park isolated from the south part of the park. And what these wildlife crossing structures have done is eliminate that genetic isolation. It's really neat. Across the Y-to-Y region, there are now 109 wildlife crossing structures, underpasses and overpasses in the area. We're getting there. We're getting to where a number of different agencies consider connectivity of wildlife across busy roads. Obviously, that's where we want to get to in the long term. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Idaho, that really, it didn't have any overpasses, and it has a number of areas that are really challenging. One of the things that is really important in large landscape conservation is to do learning exchanges. And so in this case, we were able to bring down Terry McGuire, who was the engineer for the Banff crossing structures, and do a training with Idaho. We thought maybe 20 people. We thought, you know, maybe a couple hours. It was 70 people. It was an all-day workshop with some folks from Montana Department of Transportation calling in, and there's really, really strong interest. The time is now. What was great too was, out of that meeting, they came to us and they said, you know, we've got this great opportunity with some public dollars. We have a conflict zone right here, Highway 21. You can see wildlife tracks going right toward the road. This is the actual area where an overpass could go, but they needed private dollars. And so, you know, our answer was, well, we'll find those private dollars, and we're working with a number of folks to do that. They've now secured the federal funds, and this will very likely be their first wildlife overpass in the region. And it's really, really important to their wildlife heritage. Likewise, down on closer to Yellowstone National Park, there's Highway 20. It includes the longest main street in North America, just west of Yellowstone National Park. First road wildlife are going to hit. This section in this picture is a section that they've deemed unsafe, and they want to straighten it and do some things to allow speed to increase and also safety for the highway. One of the things that happened was there's interagency grizzly bear study team data, which the National Park Service is part of. There's also the Department of Transportation with other entities like WCS created a study to look at ungulate crossings. So we know where some of the hot spots are for these wildlife. And actually, when I drove this road, right where the probable overpass could go, I saw a dead deer last June. How do you get this done? It's about engaging with community. So it turns out in Island Park, they really don't, you know, residents there try not to drive at night. It is a killing zone. It's really unsafe to drive, particularly at the speeds that it's at, that they offer, knowing that particularly certain times of the year, wildlife are migrating in and out of Yellowstone National Park. And so that community is super engaged. It might be the hunting clubs, it might be the you know, older ladies hiking clubs. They're all hands-on. They've been giving input to the Department of Transportation and alternatives that just came out for the different ways that they might reconstruct this road. Every single one of them include wildlife connectivity. I think that's a really important piece. They've got further to go. They've got to figure out where those funds are going to come from, if depending on what alternative they push forward. Again, this map on the left just shows the various places we're now working on over 1,000 miles of road, trying to make it safer in the region, with so many different partners, because local communities really understand that you know, their personal impact when they get hit to themselves, to their vehicles, but also the impacts to wildlife and the lost opportunities for wildlife. There are other types of coexistence that are really important too. This is on the left, you see animals that are left out on the landscape. They can be attractants. They're quite bad for large carnivores. Arranging for carnivore composting is a really important feature. Engaging communities in coexistence activities. So how do you scale that up? One of the things we do, we don't try to be in every community, but we try to offer funding to get these kinds of things started, to create a culture. So last year we funded a group called the Tom Minor Basin Association. That's the first valley north of Yellowstone. When I was there 2 springs ago, Wolfpack was chasing an elk right through a cow herd. Not ideal. So how do you keep the ranching community alive and being willing to coexist with some of these animals? It's creating a culture. This is a range rider who spends their summer out with cattle, decreasing that conflict. So there's a number of different tools that we're trying to spread and slowly change the culture from one of fear, one of frustration at having to live with these animals, to one of pride. So another huge threat is the pace of growth. I lived in Bozeman for the last 16 years, and Bozeman grew by 28% over a 10-year period. These places are seen as the go-to places. As we have more mobile jobs, we're seeing a lot of people move here. We have baby boomers retiring like crazy. And the thing is that they're not just moving into a small community in high rises, they're gobbling up land. What's the problem with that? The problem is that our protected areas are literally being ringed with development. The work of many researchers have shown that the more isolated and the more development that happens around parks, the more likely parks are to lose species from parks, and let alone processes and other things. The pace of growth is so high. We really risk becoming the Colorado Front Range if we don't get on top of it. And yet we don't really have the resources of the larger conservation community to work at community by community levels. So one of the ways that we're working is moving forward. This is an example from last year, but this next year, Y2Y is hosting the Mountain Town Planner Summit. And actually, Elaine Leslie is one of the people from the National Park Service who's sitting on the committee because it matters for these gateway mountain communities that are right outside of national parks. How do we help them speak to each other about opportunities, challenges, and together come up with a practice across the region of mountain communities, not just Y2Y, because we share both. We try to learn lessons from broader areas like Tahoe and eastern mountain ranges, but also share what we know. So that's one of the ways that we're just trying to work with. How do we have communities that thrive now and in the long term and in harmony with conservation? So I'll stop there just to say, I think that the founders of Y2Y, and certainly I see this as well, really see this as a legacy opportunity for the future generations of these bears, for the future generations of people and of other wildlife. So I will now open it up to questions, and I think Cass, you'll jump in and help moderate that. Is that right?
Yes, I will, Jodi. And I'm going to go ahead and open up all the lines. We do have a couple of questions in the question box that we'll start off with. So while I'm opening up the lines, feel free to either just plug your questions into that question panel, or when we have a moment in between those questions, feel free to just raise your voice and ask the question. So our first question, Jodi, is, does your work extend beyond terrestrial species? There's been a lot of work tracking golden eagles as they migrate the length of the Y2Y corridor, and it provides a critical connection between their breeding and wintering areas.
Yeah, golden eagles are so cool. About 20 minutes from me, there's a place where on some days you can see up to 200 golden eagles going, using the thermals to go over this pass at any point in time. They are a quintessential Y2Y animal, and we've long supported the work of people studying these movements of these animals. We also, I didn't talk about it today, but we have climate change program where we're actually working with the agencies in the crown of the continent, looking at things like how do we plan for and actively manage for climate change on things like long trout that are going to be challenged and are already challenged, and other species in that region. So absolutely, it's both aquatic, it's volant species, those that fly, and terrestrial species. And one of the papers we came out with last year was actually a paper with the University of Montana and a number of other scientists looking at what we call gravel bed ecosystems. There are 19 major rivers out of this area, and that most of them are gravel bed ecosystems. And that means where I'm sitting in the town of Canmore, I'm sitting on 150 feet of water underneath me. It is literally, the whole valley is an active gravel bed ecosystem. It's a really unfortunately placed town, and there are a number of those, but how do we avoid continuing that legacy in important areas? Because what that paper showed, it had microbial biologists and grizzly bear biologists and everybody all together demonstrating the disproportionate importance of these gravel bed ecosystems, which go way beyond the boundaries of the actual river that we see above ground.
Okay. I have successfully opened up all the lines, but we do have one more question in the box here on protecting biodiversity. This comment and question says, I'm very involved in a growing campaign to protect the Appalachian Trail landscape. It features a relatively low level of wildlife corridors other than migratory birds, but is very rich in biodiversity. Any thought about how we sell the landscape corridor concept for the AT around protecting biodiversity?
Yeah, I actually just spent some time with some folks who are working on the Appalachian Trail, and I think it's such a great story of and something that people can personally experience by being on the trail itself. And I think there's a significant amount of research that's showing different species of trees and wildlife who are actively have shifted historically and are shifting currently. And so that landscape level connectivity actually is really important. People like Mark Anderson have been working on it, and on trying to understand what those most important places might be. And I think the Appalachians can and should be an anchor for that. I kind of lost the question, so I hope I answered it at all. But if I didn't, Cass, tell me.
I think so, but Ron, I know you asked the question, and your line should be open if you want to clarify anything.
Yeah, Jodi, this is Ron Tipton. I'm the CEO of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, and that is, what you said is helpful. We've just started to think about how we build the science case for marketing the Appalachian Trail for its biodiversity, because we don't have large mammals, very many large mammals that are using it as a corridor. And but we do have a lot of old growth forest and habitat that's important. So I appreciate what you said, and I know that this is going to be a challenge for us, I think.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, another angle that I think is really important in mountain ecosystems, two angles actually. One is that the topography of mountains lends itself really well to being a climate refuge, because if you're on the Great Plains and your habitat moves 100 miles north, but you can't actually move that fast because you don't have that mobility, it's going to be harder to adapt and move north. Whereas in a mountain chain, you can change angles, you can change aspects, you can move north-south often, certainly in the Appalachians, that's an important thing. And so you have all these micro-habitats that are so important. That's probably not your best way forward, but I think it is an important communication tool over the long term. The other thing, which does, I think, speak to most people, is water, right? As we have increasing climate uncertainty, the conservation of water and the ability of mountains to actually be sponges, because they are the headwaters, is going to be more and more and more important. And so, maybe think about playing with those two ideas too, Ron.
Yeah, I really agree on watersheds. We're focusing a great deal on key watersheds.
Wonderful.
Great. And once again, the lines are open, so feel free to speak up if you have another question.
I will say, you know, I would love to hear about some of the challenges that folks face as they think about working at a larger scale. Maybe it's beyond a protected area. What are the challenges? What are the key tools that you all have been using that could be useful for the broader audience to hear?
Jodi, while people are thinking about that, I do have a question for you. I know for the Park Service, one of our biggest challenges of landscape scale work is shared data management. And I'm just curious, I know Y2Y has been at this for over 20 years, and I'm curious what you all have found to be most effective with data management and sharing that across such a huge landscape.
Yeah, you know, it continues to be a challenge for us. I mean, one of the things that I realized, so in the early 2000s, there was a point where we put spatial data layers. We paid another NGO to manage existing spatial data layers. And one, it's really expensive, and so it ultimately wasn't maintained. But two, the thing that I find most interesting is that a lot of these data layers become quickly outdated. And so, you know, it is important to pay attention to historic data and to maintain certain kinds of it. But I think that the amount of information and data that's being generated in a region like Y2Y is phenomenal. And what we do, particularly when we give out grants to groups, is we encourage and sometimes require them to place data in places like Databasin, which is a publicly accessible place where people can drop their spatio-analytical data and share it with others. It's actually quite rich if you haven't used it or haven't seen it. But again, you know, it's really, really hard, and I think the hardest part is ensuring that the quality of the metadata is also existing with that spatial data set. You know, there's so many opportunities right now. We have a postdoc who's proposing trying to collect and sort of unify all of the existing camera data, because there are actually tons of different camera studies at different scales asking different questions. But over time, having, you know, some sort of a database of what those pictures were, and trying to encourage people not just to look at their focal species, but use the additional data that they're collecting, or at least make it available to others in some sort of way, could be super productive. But again, all of that comes at a cost. And so it is hard to encourage people to do that. So I guess I would have to say, Kaz, that we don't have a silver bullet. You know, I wish, you know, that data was more available for everyone across the region.
Absolutely. Other questions that folks may have for Jodi? Okay. Other comments that might answer Jodi's question of things that have worked well for other initiatives?
Well, Cass and Jodi, this is Brian with the Park Service. I had I guess, a question, Jodi, and I don't know if this fits into what you're just asking, Cass, but you know, for the Park Service, a lot of the involvement of relates around visitor use, recreation. How much of a role has that played, or how important is that to Y2Y? Is, from what it sounds like, a lot of the kind of the, I don't want to say advertising, but kind of getting the word out, educating and making folks and communities all aware. A lot of it kind of focuses around wildlife and charismatic megafauna. How important has like access been, you know, for recreation, for boating, hiking, all of those things, for connecting some of those protected areas? Like, has that been a useful strategy for communicating what you all are trying to do?
Yeah, I think it's fundamental. So whether it's whether it's the salmon cellus where we're working on issues, or actually places like in the Cabinet for Cells where we're working on jumping slugs, which I really love. I didn't talk about them because they aren't the quintessentially charismatic species, but really important animals and cool. I've never seen a jumping slug. I want to see one. But that the jumping slug piece is about actually getting kids and communities engaged in monitoring and restoration. And, I think the recreation community, whether they're off-road vehicle users or whether there's hunters or whether they're hikers or bikers or whatever, they are such an important constituency because they get why, they have their favorite areas, and they tend to really be interested in both the science, but also where there are challenges, they want to engage and be an active participant in the solution. And so I think they're critical. I think parks in and of themselves are super important. One of the challenges that we face in the Y2Y region is we have a lot of parks that are literally being loved to death. And so, I think budget, for running parks and maintaining the level of visitation that we have in places like Banff or Yellowstone or many of the other parks, it's really, really a challenge. And the push is always to develop more infrastructure to accommodate more people, sometimes at the expense of ecological integrity. And I have a mantra, which is, people love parks and we need more of them. Alberta right now, is really looking to diversify its economy from that energy extractive economy that you saw with all the development that's been going on to, one of the key pieces is to a recreation tourist economy. And, if you want to do that, you got to sustain your land. There was a great piece about Colorado and how they are prioritizing saving as much land as they can. This was in Harper's Magazine because they recognize that the importance of it to economy and also to the values of community living there, and all those people who love to recreate. So I think that's a super important piece.
And how about also that bottleneck you spoke about, where there's a lot of energy development for the oil sands and other development. How receptive have they been for what you all again are trying to do with protecting that connectivity for the Y2Y? I mean, are some of the companies willing to work with you and partners?
Yep. We have some, and that's the thing, is finding those individuals within companies who love to hike, who love to get out. I think one of the really cool things actually about moving to Canada is the number of people, of course, half of Alberta, maybe more than half of Alberta is somehow tied to the energy industry, but 3/4 of those people really love to hike in the Y2Y region. And so they get cost and consequence, and where we can find solutions, it's really important. That said, sometimes collaborative conservation is really hard. Sometimes it takes a hammer. One of the hammers right now in that region where there's such heavy industrial development is the Species at Risk Act, which is like the Endangered Species Act in the U.S. And sometimes having that threat of the hammer over the top of the head convinces people that maybe they ought to rebalance, in this case, that landscape to stop the massive decline of this species of caribou. So sometimes it's a hammer, and sometimes it's going after what they love, and sometimes it's both together.
Yeah.
Great. Any remaining questions for Jodi?
All right, this is Brian. I have one more.
Okay.
Well, this is, I was really fascinated by that other slide you mentioned that, Elaine Leslie's going to be going to with trying to, have those difficult discussions, I guess, around planning, community planning, or, where people want to live in these mountain towns. Like, how, it seems like that's really a difficult conversation, and because so many of those people who want to live in those towns are the same people who often really speak out in supporting parks and conservation and all the rest, but yet the impacts of all that development is taking some of those, maybe it's a working forestry operation where it's not ideal, but at least it's not covered with with sprawl. Like how what do you have any like suggestions or best practices for like or messaging for talking with those communities? Because again, like those are the same people that are giving probably you and a lot of other NGOs a lot of money, right? I mean, how do you?
Yeah, I mean, so it can cut both ways. I think
Right.
Where I have seen the best success is a program I used to be involved with in the Adirondacks, and they created something called the Adirondack Blue Line. And conservationists were part of it, but the cool thing was the townships were part of it, elected officials, health NGOs were part of it, and they all wanted to be a bigger collective voice of public interest together to Albany. And what amazed me on the sprawl issue is that, yeah, we care about sprawl because it impacts birds and other wildlife in the Adirondacks. But it turns out if you care about healthcare, you really don't want to have the grandma who can no longer drive anymore, who's living in a house 30 miles from the nearest the nearest hospital, because it's going to cost you a lot of money to get the ambulance there every time she needs to get in. Likewise, towns don't like it because they have to maintain, the support services like school buses, maintaining the roads and other things. And it actually that sprawl ends up costing a lot of money. And so I think in part, some of it is about understanding what a healthy community is and not hearing, that this is a conservation issue, but this is a community level issue. And it's going to cost taxpayers more if we have more sprawl, and it's going to be more expensive to live in the community if we don't do it right. And that really needs, I think the most effective thing is actually bringing in different sectors of community to really talk about a vision together. Often, town commissions, county commissions are actually really pretty much predominantly run by developers, and that's when you don't have an engaged community. When you get an engaged community, that can really turn itself upside down. So it's about providing that broader vision, which is not a conservation vision. That's just one angle of it, but a more holistic vision of what a thriving community looks like. And I think that's where the Mountain Town Planner Group last year really went there and thought about those things, and I think can continue to do that.
Cool, thank you.
So, yeah.
Jodi, I did get one more question in the box, so we'll wrap it up with this one last question if you still have a few minutes.
Sure.
Says, can you share any lessons or insights in how elected representatives or other decision makers can be encouraged to support landscape scale conservation efforts?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes, it is a challenging issue at some level. I think, we're seeing right now, I'll talk first in Canada and then in the US. And I think in Canada, many levels of government here are really seeing that right now, and they're adhering to really national standards that really push large landscape conservation. But that's not always the case here, and not always the case in the US. And so I think the most important thing for elected officials is to make it safe for them to be able to support conservation. And to do that requires a constituency that's an engaged constituency that's demanding it. And I think there's a great example in Idaho where Senator Reich, who really doesn't have a good conservation voting record, he proposed wilderness legislation for the Scotchman Peaks last year. And he did that because there's a community of people who love to hike Scotchman Peak, and they really love that area, and they do want to see it conserved. And they're part of a bigger collaborative up there in northern Idaho, Montana, British Columbia. But his constituency is so strongly for it that it makes it okay for him to step out into that arena. And I think that's how we get them to engage in their own backyard and eventually understand how that connects to other things. I think the other issue, particularly in the U.S. right now, is that I think that level, that community-based level, is how we're going to get away from conservation being a partisan issue to being the bipartisan issue that it needs to be.
Well, thank you so much, Jodi. This has been a really wonderful webinar. I'm sure everyone who's been tuning in has agreed. It's just great to dive into one of the best practices really for landscape scale initiatives that we have. So thank you so much for your time and for putting together this incredible presentation. I would like to say just thanks again on behalf of the Scaling Up Initiative for tuning in. We are working on our 2018 schedule for webinars, so if you have ideas, feel free to send them our way. Again, our whole focus here is to expose best practices as well as tools that enable parks and programs to work beyond boundaries. So thanks again, everyone. The recording of this webinar will be added this afternoon, both to our internal toolkit as well as to a YouTube channel with the Network for Landscape Conservation. So if you know of someone who missed it but would benefit from listening in, feel free to pass around those links to those folks. Okay, thanks again, Jodi. And
thank you.
Everyone, have a good afternoon.
All right, you too.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye-bye.